Okay, so if we're talking about the four measurements that truck manufacturers do not list on their spec sheets, one of the most important is the pivot angle. And the first thing you have to understand about that is the location of the pivot axis. So if you imagine a line that connects the 2 points that are the place where the hanger sits in the pivot cup, so the place where the metal piece of the hanger goes into that little cup in the base plate, and it touches the bottom where the pivot is actually pivoting, from that point connecting up here to the point in the center of the hanger where it goes around the kingpin, where the two bushings are sandwiched, right where the center of that spot where the bushings are interacting with the hanger to apply pressure to take it back to the center. The line that connects the pivot point and the bushing seat, that's the pivot axis line. And then the angle that that line makes compared to the base plate is your pivot angle. And that's critical for how much your truck turns. Okay, so we're talking about the four measurements that the truck manufacturers do not list on their websites when it comes to the truck specs. Another one is the Axel Offset. So if you're looking at the pivot axis line, and then you take a 90 degrees from that line to the center of the axle, and you have the distance from the axle center to perpendicular to the pivot axis, that distance is the Axel Offset. Okay, so if we're talking about the four measurements that truck manufacturers don't list on their spec sheets, one of them is the Axel Base factor. So if you look at a set of trucks that pretend they're mounted on the skateboard, the wheelbase is the distance between these two sets of holes, the inner mounting points. But then if you look, you can see that the axles are further apart than those two holes are because each truck has a base factor. The distance between the mounting point and where the axle actually is. So it's about that distance right there is your base factor. And you have to add that in twice, or if it's different for each truck, the front and the rear can be different. You have to add that in to get the total axle base factor. So you have the wheel base and the axle base, and the difference for each truck is the base factor. So if we're looking at the four measurements that truck manufacturers don't list on their spec sheets of the trucks they make, one of the important ones is the Kingpin angle. So if you imagine the kingpin being right here, the solid piece of metal that goes all the way through, and you take an imaginary line right down the center of it, which in this case is hollow, that would be the kingpin axis. And then the angle between that imaginary line and then the base plate gives you the kingpin angle. And this is also important for how the truck turns, in particular, how much force it takes to turn to a certain number of degrees.